Welcome to WCAT TV and radio. I'm Kiki Latimer, and I'm your host for the Catholic Bookworm. And I'm very excited to have with me today Emily Hicks from St. Mary's Seminary and University in Baltimore, right, Maryland?
Yes.
So Emily has also been part of the Journal of Seminary Journal that I've done, 8 other interviews. So it's been wonderful. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Could you just start us off with a brief prayer?
Sure. This is how I begin my class sessions, with this prayer every morning. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Direct, O Lord, all our actions by your holy inspiration, and carry them on by your gracious assistance, so that every prayer and work of ours may always begin from you, and by you be happily ended, through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you. Oh, Emily, could you just, to start us off, just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm an English teacher, an ESL teacher. I came to St. Mary's in 2012 to work with their international seminarians in the areas of reading, writing, and especially pronunciation. Since that time, our international population has grown, and so has the language resources program here. And so I just work on developing those resources for our international students, as well as the academic resources for our native-born seminarians.
Thank you. I'm always amazed. I worked at Holy Apostles College and Seminary in Cromwell, Connecticut for about 6 years with primarily Vietnamese seminarians, but we also had students from various places in Europe and I think Central and South America. And first of all, it amazed me that someone, with a second language, English as their second language, was studying theology. That just was, they're very brave.
Right.
I was studying theology for my master's at the same time, and I thought, I can't imagine studying this in another language.
I know. Yeah. It does take, they do have to be very intelligent to do it, and have really a great deal of humility to put themselves in a position where they can be corrected and really open to learning and getting rid of those obstacles that interfere with their language learning and then their theological learning.
Yeah, I mean, for the Vietnamese, where you have such an entirely different language, French, Spanish, it's got closer connections to English. I know some German, some French, some Spanish, not fluent in any of them, but I was amazed. I tried to learn a little bit of Vietnamese while I was there. It was impossible. Like my brain just said, no, don't. I couldn't get through one cassette.
Oh, God.
My brain was going, what? I just couldn't even hear it. Never mind, speak it. So I was fascinated by their the perseverance, both of the nuns that we had at the seminary for religious life and the young men there. They really had to persevere and, like you're saying, be brave, and the humility, to do this. So you start off talking about, I should mention the name of your article is Teaching Language Skills to International Students in Catholic Seminaries and the Critical Component of Culture. And obviously, culture is such a huge, huge thing. When I first was there, the students would ask me, what's your name? And I would say, Kiki, call me Kiki. And so then at some point I realized they were calling me Doctor Kiki. I was like, Doctor? What is this Doctor? And I realized that they were saying Dr. Kiki.
Oh, okay.
And I would say, no, just Kiki. So then they would say, Teacher Kiki. And I was like, all right, but you can really just call me Kiki. But for most of, at least the Vietnamese students, because of the cultural differences, some of them could never get close to calling me just Kiki. A few, it took 2 or 3 years of me saying, just Kiki. and eventually they would call me Kiki. It took a long time, and it was cultural, that was unacceptable in their culture to call a professor or a teacher or anybody that was sort of above them in the hierarchy by just their first name.
Right. Yeah. That element of power distance, right? Some cultures, the power distance is much greater, and so you have that that respect, almost reverence, for someone you perceive in a higher position. Yeah. In the United States, of course, our power distance is much lower.
It
We
certainly
don't.
changed.
Yeah.
I mean, I grew up, I'm 65. So, I mean, I grew up, you either called an adult, Mr. and Mrs. or aunt and uncle, even if they weren't really your aunt and uncle or professor or doctor. But you just never called someone older than you by their first name. And I remember after college, my good friend and colleague now, Stephen Schwartz, at one point he said to me, "Please, Kiki, just call me Steve." And I was like, "What?" It took me a good year before I could call him by his first name. I continued with Dr. Schwartz for a long time. It felt wrong. So I get that. It's very interesting. And it has changed. I mean, we have become a much more familiar culture, much more relaxed culture about titles. So it wouldn't cross my mind to be referred to as Mrs. Latimer anywhere. But that was what I grew up with. Yeah.
Right.
So we have this, John Paul II talked about that we really need to acknowledge the cultural context and that we're sharing, we're sharing a space with other people, but the cultural context can be very different. And can cause a lot of confusion and a lot of mistakes. But he really wanted to point to the idea that, underlying culture, we do have human nature. And obviously somehow culture gets measured by that, but we have this human nature to tap into, things that we all have in common. But that can be kind of wrapped up in culture. Yes,
absolutely. Yeah, we in every culture you'll find the similar things, right? How we approach hierarchy, as we talked about with the power distance, how we approach gender roles, how we we have these similar things in all these cultures. It's just the cultures will solve these problems, these problems of identity or problems of hierarchy in varying ways, but we have that commonality. And so it's tapping into first recognizing, okay, what is my culture? Where am I coming from? What are my assumptions about the world, about life, about others, about friendship, about spirituality, and how does that intersect with someone else's perceptions of these things? And they oftentimes can be very different.
Right. And if you're trying to communicate with someone and if you're unaware of those differences, it can just be a real disaster.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because the assumption is, everyone views the world the way I view the world initially, right?
Right. So. And they just don't, I remember it was about 40 years ago now, the United States was sending an ambassador to one of the Eastern countries. And they chose to send a woman to a culture that had absolutely no respect for women. And, it was a disaster in the making. They were totally confused by this. They were supposed to accept a woman ambassador as an equal in this very male hierarchical situation. And
right.
I remember back in, our classes at the time, we were just shaking our heads going like, this is not going to go well. And I don't believe it did, because there was that confusion of gender roles. And you can't, it's great to say, well, this is how it should be. But you can't just force that on another culture. and
Right.
expect it overnight to work out well.
Mm-hmm.
Those awarenesses of that. So a lot of times our intercultural students come with, they come with some English, usually, but it's
Yes.
usually book learning.
Mm-hmm.
So
It
pronunciation.
depends. Yeah, it depends on which culture, you know. So some students come to the seminary, and all their learning really has been oral. Not so many books in some countries are, they're not as accessible as they are here in the United States. And other cultures come doing a lot of reading and writing. So they're both international students, both of these groups, yet their needs are much different in the seminary context.
So you start out having to assess all of that, reading skills, listening skills, writing. You have to work at all of that and then sort of figure out where they should go from there.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. But this goes for not only international, all seminarians, when they come, they have to take the same diagnostic. Because, native English speakers have some challenges as well with writing or reading. And so we want to be sure that everybody gets the support they need so they can be academically successful.
You mentioned that can be really difficult for a student who in their own country has, been deemed as being very intelligent, sort of top of their class, which maybe is why they got sent. And all of a sudden they find themselves here sort of at the bottom of that totem pole.
Right.
That's got to be difficult.
It is. It is very challenging. And part of, the studies that I've been doing, the intercultural studies, has been, trying to find ways in which, we can connect with that student to help him understand that we're all on the same team. All we want is for him to be academically successful. But, when they come from cultures where their status is very high, this can be a really great blow. And so we have to be very careful, very affirming, and in the way we approach it, so that the seminarian will be, will receive what it is we are suggesting and offering to him.
Yeah, that can be very difficult, I would think.
It is. It's, we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot in this process, and that really took us down the road to study these intercultural competencies more intentionally, and not only bringing this awareness to the international seminarians, but also to the faculty and to the seminary community as a whole, because it's the ability to communicate across cultures, or just because as humans we're comprised of multiple cultures anyway. We're going to have to interact with all kinds of people where we don't really see eye to eye, and giving students and faculty the resources to do that well, or at least something else to think about. Not that everybody needs these resources, but just something to think about, a greater awareness and some time to practice stretching that part of to communicate more effectively, I think has been helpful.
Also, you mentioned about like unspoken language skills. We speak differently with different people. My husband always says he can tell who I'm talking to on the phone just by my tone of voice.
Right. Yeah.
He can tell whether I'm talking to one of the kids or a girlfriend or, my doctor. You can tell. So there's those unspoken skills that change depending on whom we're with, what group we're with, even within our own culture. And we sort of know those rules and regulations, but an international student coming in wouldn't know them. And those are tougher things to teach, how your language changes from group to group. And there was a funny story years ago at the University of Rhode Island. There was a group of international students I don't remember where they were from, but their English was very limited, and they were here for the summer, and they sort of got thrown into one of the fraternities, and they were learning their language skills in the fraternity.
Oh gosh.
And so they learned the greeting between the guys was "How the F you doing?"
Oh my
You know,
goodness.
how, you know, F being the expletive, and so that's what they learned, and they just learned it as an expression.
Mhm.
I had no idea what it meant. Just that's how you greeted one another. And then there was a big gathering for them at the home of the president and his wife of the university, where they were to meet the president and meet his wife. And they got introduced to
Oh
his wife
no.
first in a very formal setting. And they shook her hand and one by one said, "How the F you doing?"
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Oh
And they
no.
had to be sort of scooted aside and had their English quickly fixed.
Yes.
But it was just priceless example. You know, they meant no disrespect whatsoever.
Right.
You know, they were just learning language as just as an expression without any sense of it. We had another funny experience like that at Holy Apostles, where the nuns were very into the flower arranging at the in the chapel, and they loved orchids. And there was one orchid that they found out was called the Naked Lady. And they loved this orchid, and they showed up one day at the cafeteria, and they're sitting down with the seminarians, and they asked the seminarians, "Have you seen a naked lady?" The seminarians who had more English than them were like horrified, and they were like, "No, we've never seen one." And they said, "Well, you have to see a naked lady. They're beautiful."
Oh
So
my
this
gosh.
conversation ensued that was just priceless until they finally realized they were discussing orchids.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, language things can be really, really funny, you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They have some good moments.
Right. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I did a lot of work with the seminarians there with pronunciation, especially with the Vietnamese, because they had such a hard time
Mm-hmm.
with pronunciation of things.
Yes.
Because it was quite bad. Occasionally, when they were reading in the chapel, I remember the one seminarian, the scripture he had to read had to do with being toil. He toiled in the vineyard, and he could not say toiled. It just came out as toilet every time. He
Oh
toiled
no.
in the vineyard, and there was no getting toiled out of him.
Okay.
I finally said, "We got to change it to worked in the vineyard." You know,
Right. Right. Oh, okay.
we're going to have an entire chapel of giggling seminarians if you
No
use
kidding.
toilet. You know?
Yes. 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 Yeah.
But,
Pronunciation is. Yeah.
approaching it with humor can really be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yes. Yeah, making sure that the classroom, that there's levity in the classroom for sure, and making it a safe place. And again, I think this is where the work and the workshops and the things we're doing with the intercultural studies has really helped bring in that safety in the classroom, because we have a common language to speak. We know, we've done this workshop together, and we know that we are going to have different attitudes towards things, or different ways we phrase things, and a constant sharing of that, has been really fruitful and beneficial. So if they can feel safe in a pronunciation class to make mistakes, then they'll make much more progress, because of course the default is to be very insecure about it, and not put yourself out there. So because pronunciation is such a personal part of you, it's so challenging. So, just being very affirming and laughing with the students has been very beneficial to their progress.
Yeah, you mentioned there was one word that I actually had to look it up because I didn't know it. My daughter, who teaches Italian, knew it, but I'm going to jump ahead to that. Is it prosody or prosody?
Prosody, yeah, prosody.
I knew the concept of, intonations and the music of language, but I hadn't heard that word, but Jenny was familiar with it. But you mentioned, I jumped ahead to this only because you said it's sort of in our bones. We start hearing language in utero.
Right. Exactly. The vibration of the mother's voice becomes very, as you said, it's in our bones. And so when you have to adjust that, it feels wrong. It feels bad. For some students, it almost feels like a betrayal of their culture, a betrayal of who they are. And to modify that, it can be very, very difficult for some students, just on a psychological level, let alone, just let alone the mechanics, getting your tongue to go to a place in your mouth where it doesn't want to go. It is not accustomed to going. And so there's a lot that goes on with pronunciation.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah. Babies are actually born crying in an accent. Did you know that?
No, I had not heard that.
Babies are born crying in an accent that they've heard. So if you were, that kind of language specialist, you could just hear a baby cry and know whether it's from Germany or Japan or the United States.
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes perfect sense. In one of my classes, I show this. Well, when we're learning intonation, there's a video called Babbling Babies, and you have these twin well, they're not quite toddlers, but these twin babies, and they're talking to one another, but you can tell they're asking questions and answering, and just by their intonation. And so it kind of illustrates that point that you just mentioned about the baby's cry. It makes sense.
Yeah. Just the personal nature of how culture is so it's wrapped around many things: food, clothing, but language is the big thing that, infiltrates everything. I remember years ago, I have a girlfriend, she's still a good friend, and she had gone to Germany. She was fluent in German. I was just learning German at the time. And she had a very important, very poignant experience when she was in Germany. But it all happened in German. And then she came back and she just needed to talk it out with a girlfriend, a close friend, but she didn't have a close friend who spoke German. And it was very interesting to me. She explained to me in English that she needed to tell the story in German because that's how it had happened. And I had learned just enough German to be able to say, I think I can follow the story. I know enough I can't speak that well, but I can listen and follow the gist of the story. And so she was able to just pour her heart out in German and just get it all out. And I remember it was a really beautiful experience. But it also taught me something, that we do sort of live and move within a language. And I had never thought about that before. And I remember her saying it would make no sense to tell this story in English. Because it was this deeply personal experience.
Yes.
So and you can see to switch language, especially on something so deeply intimate as our religion, as our spirituality, as our communication with God. I mean, that's what a seminarian is being called to do. That's a very
yeah, and the anthropologist Edward T. Hall, writes about how, he says, the biggest job, or I'm paraphrasing, but the biggest challenge perhaps to cultural studies is that it's not that we're learning about other cultures, is that we're learning about our own. Because he says we have these built-in kind of blinders to why we think the way we think, why we feel the way we feel, but because of the history, the experiences, the language of a culture, and that to unravel those cultural processes is very challenging. So because we're not even aware they're there. And so, as you get to the spirituality and the theology, those levels, it's going inward and understanding, how these different facets, how these different aspects of my personality, my culture, my experience have shaped who I am. And so it's an opportunity, to look at all of that from a different perspective.
One of the beautiful things done at Holy Apostles was that when they did the the Rosary as a community, whoever was leading that decade of the Rosary that day, they did it in their own language. So we got to hear this beautiful, intonations of a prayer, obviously, that we were all familiar with. But we got to hear it in, French and Spanish and Nigerian and Vietnamese, and it was beautiful to be able to have that. And sweet, yeah.
Yeah, we did something similar in my class when we would take turns saying the sign of the cross before we prayed. And I had a student from Congo, and he led us in the French sign of the cross, but they sang it. So he got up and taught the class, how to sing, in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And it was great. It was really another level of bonding, learning the sign of the cross together.
Yeah, it's sweet when you can share those things. You talked about, we've mentioned a few of them already, but 5 cultural dimensions. We've mentioned power distance, with that hierarchy of people around us. Obviously, individualism. It's really, really high in the United States.
Yes.
Compared to other cultures.
Right. Yes. And of course, this can be problematic in what we would call problematic, they wouldn't call problematic, but classroom participation, even developing a thesis statement that's based upon your own thinking and your own claim, as opposed to relying on an authority. So for students, that is from the other end, from a more collectivist culture, might have difficulty doing that, as opposed to, a student from a more individualistic culture.
Many years ago, I read about an agricultural project study that was done, I believe somewhere in Africa, but I don't remember for sure. But it was a very successful project. They brought in, a whole agricultural scheme for the village to learn how to do, and whatever they were growing went really well. And it was a big 2-year study. And at the end of the study, the reporters and the people doing the study went in to interview the women in the village, to interview them as to how the study had impacted the village. And when they were asked, how has the study impacted the community? They had lots to say. And then how has the study impacted your family? Well, they had lots to say about that. It was all wonderful. And then they were asked the question, and it's so fascinating to me, how has this project affected you as an individual? And they didn't understand the question. Translators that were there tried and tried, and they simply had no understanding. They couldn't answer that question. They didn't understand the question. There was no view of themselves as an individual in the culture.
Right. Yeah. It's not I, it's we. Yeah.
Yeah. They just, that wasn't part of their thinking. And it does help you to, when you hear something like that, I think it does help you to see how differently you think. Like that when you're not even aware of it.
Exactly. And knowing that about certain cultures, we can talk about, because some of the students will perceive our individualistic attitudes really as rejection, rejection of them, and a lack of openness, a coldness towards them, and so it's important for them to work through those initial feelings to understand, what's really at play here, and that it's not those things per se.
That's fascinating. You also mentioned, well, gender roles, obviously very, very different from culture. At Holy Apostles, I mean, there were so many women on campus with between the nuns and professors that for the most of the time it was never an issue. I only had one moment. I was co-teaching with the vice rector of the college, and he had to leave unexpectedly about a third of the way through the semester for personal reasons. And so I wound up with the class, and a couple of the Vietnamese young men just assumed that the rector of the college would step in and teach the class. And I said, no, he's now doing the job of two people for the rest of the semester. You're not going to see him. And it was interesting. For about 2 weeks, I could tell it was definitely a combination of the gender thing and the laity, that I was a lay person and a woman teaching homiletics. And this one young man in particular was just horrified by the thought that he was going to be taught homiletics by a laywoman. I had to be like, I'm a real girly girl, and I had to be like this really masculine meanie for about 2-3 weeks. Like really had to be badass, to kind of get across that, I had authority. Class, and I hated having to do that. But it was interesting. He responded to that. It was fascinating. I had to really assert my authority. And then he was like, okay, I'll learn from you because you've asserted your authority.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting. And I think it really depends on the culture group too. And that would make a very fascinating study. But as one of the only women teaching faculty at our institution, when the students come and they have to take language, number one, it's a blow for them to be in language classes, right? And then they're dealing with a woman, and I have to vary between my approaches, maybe being more authoritarian, more strict. But I found, a new lesson for me was some students from a certain culture really just don't have, they don't have the framework for a woman professional, and they kind of stick you in the mother, the mother role, the maternal role, right? And I've been really pushing against this, and I decided to kind of lean into it a little bit more, in the sense that there was some little disagreement among themselves in the classroom, and one person was dominating and correcting the others, and I just said, no, I am the queen mother. I am the one who corrects, right? And the classroom dynamics changed. Okay, they would accept that I'm the queen mother of the classroom. I'm the queen mother of grammar, of writing. And they were fine. They stopped this little infighting. They stopped this, this kind of pecking order that was going on. Excuse me. Well, I maintain my professionalism, appropriate boundaries and that sort of thing. It's for some students, when they come into the country, they just do not have another framework within which to place me, which has been really fascinating and interesting.
And you mentioned the mother thing also. I think a lot of the young men and we had the nuns, the young women, they're experiencing a lot of loneliness, a lot of isolation and loneliness. They're away from family, they're away from friends, often for the first time. They're away from their own culture, their own language, home, and home with all of its, wonderful things. So it's that alone can be very stressful,
right?
A very stressful learning, environment.
Yes. So, and we just, the more we can do to get at those things that are most important to them, making them, providing the opportunity for them to feel safe and supported, we can get at what's underlying, and their mentors and spiritual directors and formators can, take care of that. So that's important.
And, going back to John Paul II saying, underneath all of our culture is human nature. And like I mentioned, I found that humor is something that tends, even though we, find different things funny, there is a basic human element of humor where we can tap into often with one another. Although some jokes, certainly you need to know the culture to get the joke. There's so much of human nature that's funny just in and of itself. And if in humility we can tap into that, it is a great bonding place.
And the seminarians love to poke fun at one another, certainly. I say, oh, you guys are the worst. They they're a little harsh with one another, but how much they enjoy it when I'm taking part in the joke and laughing at myself too when I make a mistake. Oh my gosh, well, today you've discovered today that your teacher is not perfect, and that sort of thing has is really conducive to to fostering an effective learning environment, certainly.
Right. Yeah. My very first, most of the time a good part of the time that I was at Holy Apostles, I was working with a gentleman from Nigeria. We were co-teaching together, and I sort of got thrown into the classroom with him. He didn't really invite me. It was a long story, but I wound up co-teaching with him. But we were as different as night and day. I mean, first of all, I was white and he was black. I was American. He's Nigerian. Man, woman, laity, cleric, priest. I mean, we couldn't have been more different. And he was none too happy that I had gotten put into his classroom. I mean, we just couldn't have been more different. And, but within about 2 weeks, we both found out that we had almost an identical sense of humor. And it was that sense of humor that bonded us, and we're still like really, really good friends to this day.
Yeah.
So it was, I always think of that, So yeah, when you first got stuck in my classroom, I was not happy. And then we would just laugh over things. So, you mentioned a couple of things here. Uncertainty avoidance. What is that?
So some cultures, all cultures have a way or ways in which they deal with the ambiguous, with the uncertainty of life. And, some cultures are very comfortable with uncertainty, and others, maybe because of their history and maybe has been, I don't know, maybe tumultuous and have learned to adapt to that. Or in some cultures are very, uncomfortable with uncertainty. And so these kinds of cultures, for example, have very strict rules about hygiene, about roles, about expectations. And so when a student comes from an uncertainty avoidant culture, he really benefits from very, very clear articulation of expectations, from models of assignments, from, the instructor looking at his first draft before he submits an assignment. So knowing that about a certain culture can help professors, help their students feel more secure and confident in their classrooms.
Where is the American culture on that scale?
We're kind of mid-range. We're not completely comfortable, but we're certainly not avoidant. Yeah, like some like Central South American cultures tend to be a little more uncertainty avoidant.
Okay, interesting. And the last thing you mentioned was something called long-term orientation.
So long-term orientation is, of course, looking at how what I'm doing now will impact the future. Some students are very, short-term oriented, so they're really just thinking about today, and others, are really need to understand, okay, what you're teaching me now, why does this matter? What does this mean for me later? It's interesting because short-term oriented cultures, in addition to just, kind of thinking about living in the moment a little more. That's not to say they don't have a vision, or it's not to say that they don't have a goal for the future, but I guess it doesn't weigh as heavily on them. They're, very, very, very social, but something interesting about them is that it's very easy for them to lose face. So, so failure, being corrected, these are things that are very, very difficult for them. So I've really had to modify the way I give feedback in the classroom when I know that a student is from one of these more short-term oriented cultures. So it's kind of an interesting manifestation of that.
I was teaching homiletics, and one of the important things in homiletics was the ability of these young men, like I said, many of whom were Vietnamese, to critique one another. And that was extremely difficult for them. The first few weeks, it was like, great homily. No matter how bad it was, they'd say it was great and pat each other on the back.
Right.
And trying to break through that and explain to them that it wasn't loving for them to say that something that was bad was good, that they weren't helping each other grow. And so that they really needed to start, being honest and critiquing one another gently and kindly, but say like that was not good. And that was painful for them. You could see that was really, really difficult. And I had to say, like, I'm not going to be the only meanie here.
Right.
That helped me out here, Everybody's saying that was wonderful, and there's Kiki saying that was horrible.
Right.
So getting their cooperation was difficult.
Yes. Yeah. It requires a great mental shift, an emotional shift. So it is challenging, but they do rise to the occasion. They, because, the seminarians here want what's best for ministry in the United States. And so, once they start understanding where their challenges are in relating and being and in thinking in this culture, I've found overwhelmingly they embrace that and really work on moving forward.
Yeah, it's definitely a journey, a learning process. We had a requirement for a while that students speak English in the cafeteria. We had tried to have a law for a while on campus that they speak English all the time. But that just became impossible. It was just too difficult for them. So we asked, that at least in the cafeteria, people would work really hard at speaking English. I was wondering how that works at St. Mary's.
I think it's for the most part understood that, like the community spaces in general are the English speaking, So I mean, you'll have occasionally, a group from the same nationality will sit and they would maybe speaking their own languages, but for the most part, it's understood that it's, for example, a community lunch, a community dinner. So you're interacting with a variety of people, and would speak English in those contexts.
That's good. I have here, I've got all kinds of notes here, but you have mentioned Gert Hofstede, a Dutch social psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote, the collective programming of the mind that distinguishes the member of one group or category of people from another.
Mm-hmm.
So I was very interested in this, how we see ourselves as part of a group.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And my own experience with this, which I wanted to mention to you, because I'd love for you to comment on it. When I was in India in 2004, I was with my sister and my friend Maria, so 3 Americans, and we'd been there about 2.5 weeks when we went to the Taj Mahal. And in that 2.5 weeks, we had not seen any other Americans. We were with our Indian friends, and we bumped into other Indian people, but no Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't think I had any great identity as an American. I'm certainly not nationalistic, and I'm not all that patriotic. But at the Taj Mahal, like quite a distance from us, was a group of Americans from Boston, who at the time, unbeknownst to us, had also been in India for several weeks and had also not seen any Americans.
Okay.
Had also just been with Indian people. And the 2 groups of us saw one another, like across half a football field. And we ran towards one another and threw our arms around each other, total strangers, threw our arms around each other, laughing and giggling and like, where are you from? Oh, you're from Boston. We're from Rhode Island, as if we'd been besties our whole lives. And we were all complete strangers. And I was shocked by that experience. How, this sort of tribal identity that just came out spontaneously, that, is completely unaware of.
Right. Yeah. That's so interesting. When we think about, this collective programming of the mind, as he said, about this group identity, and you look at, studies in anthropology, how kind of that grouping, is so is innate because it keeps us safe, right?
I didn't know it was there even. It was just amazing.
Exactly right. Like we don't even recognize that it's there, but we have our identity as a culture, as a group. And deep down on a primal level, we understand this group, we are safe in this group, right? And so I think it sheds some light on how we view other and why our initial response to something that is other might be one of suspicion, but it goes back to something very, very deep, which was meant to keep us safe. But we live in such a small world now, but now it really interferes with our relationships and how we relate and communicate with one another. So I find it fascinating. I would love to do more research in that. And this is all, of course, theoretical, but it makes a lot of sense, I think. And given the issues that we have to communicate across cultural boundaries, to open ourselves up to, not be so suspicious and critical of what is other to us.
Right. It's definitely was very mysterious. You knew that I was very aware. I mean, my background is philosophy and theology, more philosophy at that point in time, but was very aware that I was experiencing something that was deeply mysterious, deeply part of human nature, and something, like you're saying, that we're unaware of. And you do start to, when you mentioned when you start to see other cultures and dig into other cultures, you start to see your own for the first time.
Exactly. Exactly. Right. Yeah. And, we need to understand who we are, as we go into any, kind of relationship, and into especially more difficult kind of dialogue. to recognize those things that are popping up within us, those defenses, I think really what gets in the way is the assumptions of the other, placing, being, instead of being objective, in listening to the other, we become very evaluative, is this good or bad? Do I like this or not? Or, so to suspend our bias and our judgment really is key to effective communication and loving the other, honestly.
Yeah. It's interesting because, with intercultural stuff to begin with, you sort of you have this baseline, this underlying foundation of human nature. But obviously, when you're teaching in a seminary, you have human nature and you also have the commonality of Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
So you have this common, at least to some extent, hopefully, you have this common deep faith and belief system that you're all working from that sort of same page.
Right.
And that's very helpful
Mm-hmm.
in the seminary setting, is you don't just have to tap into human nature or humor, but you can tap into your faith roots
Exactly.
that you share.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So one of the questions I have is the guidelines that you talk about in the article. And I know Sebastian has also written, we had a little mini course that he put together on intercultural communication.
Okay, yeah.
At Holy Park. It was actually kind of a funny, my background is in cultural communication and oral interpretation of literature and communication. So I got a notice in my inbox, I don't know if he's listening, I got a notice in my inbox that the staff and faculty it was requested that we take this little 1-credit course for free on intercultural communication. And I didn't have any idea where it was coming from. I didn't know if it was some politically correct, mumbo jumbo. I was like, oh, brother, I had to take this thing. I didn't pay any attention to where it was coming from, but I thought, well, I'm sort of on faculty here, adjunct. I better do this because I'll get in trouble if I don't, So I signed up for it. But about a week later, Sebastian, who had created this thing, was in the lunchroom, and I sat down next to him, and he said, "Oh, hi, Kiki. Have you signed up for the intercultural communications course?" And I was like, "Yeah." Probably a bunch of mumbo jumbo. He looks at me and he says, "Well, I certainly hope not. I created it."
Oh no.
So there I was with both feet in my mouth.
Oh no.
Absolutely mortified.
Oh no.
But I took it, and it was actually very good. It was good. I did learn some things, and I always felt that someone who didn't have a background in communication would have learned a lot from it. The same as with your article. There's just a lot of wonderful stuff in it that I was familiar with, but that I think will be really exciting for people that don't have that background in communication. And,
thank you.
So my question was, the whole ideas expressed in your article and in Sebastian's intercultural communication, they themselves are Western ideas, American, Western cultural ideas. The idea of wanting to get to know other cultures is an American idea. There's plenty of cultures in the world that could care less about other cultures,
right.
That don't want to get to know, don't want to do any of these things, that these ideas themselves are Western civilization ideas. I'm just curious how you would respond to that. Is it the Catholicism that can get past that, or?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think. Well, first, if we go back to natural law, first of all, there is that human need to connect, to be in relationship with others, right? So, and that manifests itself, of course, in different ways. according to the culture, but still that's something very fundamentally human, about us, our need to connect, our need to be in relationship, our need to communicate, right? And given that the world has become so small, we don't, there really isn't the option anymore in terms of just not communicating with a certain group of people because, they're different, or I don't, like this, that, or the other about them. Especially within, the Catholic Church, that's just a necessity. So I think you can look at it, from more of a natural law perspective, but also, the Catholicism, we're a multicultural church, and any minister in the church is going to have to be sensitive to other ways of thinking, of being, of believing, of adapting his communication. So, as St. Paul says, to become, to become all things to all, right?
Right.
To become, the person that, that the one they're ministering to needs to be, to build commitment, to create a community where you can build consensus, and to manage uncertainty. Life can be very uncertain. Our interactions can be uncertain. So certainly, those are all goals of, intercultural effectiveness, and there's certainly needs of a future pastor in the universal church.
And social media has certainly made the world smaller as well, and international travel. But social media is really bringing, especially with young people, they're sharing ideas across cultures, and so it's definitely going to be important for the future for pastors to be able to be aware of intercultural communications and differences, and be able to pastor to people from other cultures.
Yeah.
And it's definitely, I thought as much as it was challenging, it was very exciting to be on an international campus teaching. For the most part, I absolutely loved it.
Oh yeah, that sounds amazing. You sound like you've traveled to so many wonderful places and have had so many great experiences.
I've been to a few. Yeah, I've been blessed to do some traveling.
Yeah.
Plus, I love that. It's always fun is the food.
I know.
So my Vietnamese nuns would feed me, which was like just the best.
Oh yeah.
All sorts of Vietnamese food, which was wonderful. Yeah. So how long have you been teaching now at St. Mary's? You said
since 2012. Okay. So
it's
wonderful. Yeah.
I left Holy Apostles at the time of the pandemic and haven't been back because things changed there.
Okay.
But I still stay in touch with a lot of my students, and hoping possibly in the future for a trip to Vietnam, because a lot of them are back there now, sort of waiting.
Okay. Oh, that's wonderful. I've never been. I would love to go.
Yeah, me neither. That's like, it's so different, from American culture. It was beautiful to see how we did come together in learning things, and and I had a lot of fun. I did a lot of pronunciation stuff, like one-on-one or in small groups with them, and that was just plain funny. There was a real openness, at least with the students I worked with, because sometimes they'd have to have their fingers in their mouth to try to move their tongue in their mouth. We had mirrors and all sorts of things to get them to work on stuff, and you just had to laugh,
I know. And you do.
Yeah, and they were wonderful. The humility that I saw was beautiful. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And and I tell them too, Americans, we love accents. We just want to modify a little bit so your speech is clear. You don't have to be, it doesn't have to be perfect, but we're just going to really work on those things that interfere with the clarity of your pronunciation. So.
Yeah. Going back to humor, it just made me think when I was first in India, we had a driver named Shaker. We had him for 3 weeks with us. And he spoke Hindi and a tiny, tiny bit of English, like 10 words in English. And of course, we spoke no Hindi at all. And I think he probably was not looking forward to traveling with 3 rich white American women, which is how we appeared in India.
Of course.
And he was very dark black, and was considered like really a lowest of a servant in India. But he was not familiar with how familiar, Americans are. And so once we were in the car, we just considered him like our buddy. And he was shocked by that. He just had never hung out with Americans before. And then of course he was amazed by our sense of humor. And by the 3rd or 4th day, we were just best friends with him inside the car. We couldn't express that friendship outside the car without him losing his job. But inside the car, there was just that human nature level of friendship that occurred. It was beautiful. And the language, I felt like we spoke with him for 3 weeks, even though there was very little language abilities to speak. But the nonverbals were there, the humor was there, laughter.
Yes.
It was fun. Yeah. Those things, that humility, and also that respect for the human person. There was
exactly.
And when you have that, people know when that's there and when it's not. And you start with that deep respect. And
vulnerability. You go into these things with a great deal of vulnerability as well. And you don't have to be afraid of the uncertainty of the interaction, because it's not going to be what you've expected, certainly. And, it enables you to see more, to see the other person more clearly. And that's what I really enjoy about it. It's like, oh, okay, things are not going to be what I expect, but I'm just going to open myself up and learn what I have to learn, or what God is showing me in this situation, in this person, and what can I do to see this person more clearly.
Right, and that can just be really beautiful. India is only 2% Christian, and just a little bit of that is Catholic. But our first day in the car with Shaker, I noticed these beads hanging from the visor of the car. So I figured they were some kind of Hindi beads, and I'm looking at them and I realized that they're rosary beads. And I said, Catholic? Catholic? And so it was this amazing thing that our driver in India was Catholic.
Wow, yes.
And the first thing he did was he took us to church, and we received the Eucharist. So that was amazing.
That is,
providence. So that was really sweet.
Really wonderful.
But still, he was still a stranger. We didn't know him.
Sure.
We were getting to know him. And on our second day, we headed up into the Himalayas. And this is just such a funny story, because as we got he lived in Delhi, where it's really hot, but up in the foothills of the Himalayas, it gets really cold.
Okay.
And by the time we were headed up this tiny mountain road to this village, like 6,000 feet up, it was cold and it was dark. But it was a beautiful starry night, and we 3 American women, like, the first thing we did was, when we saw the stars as we're going up this mountain road, we rolled down the windows, and we got our heads hanging out the window, and we're like, look at the stars, it's so beautiful. And all of a sudden, Shaker pulls the car over on the side of the road and stops and turns the car off. And all 3 of us have the same thought, Oh no! This is where we get murdered. Right. And he gets out of the car, and of course he can't speak English, so he can't tell us why he stopped. He gets out of the car, he grabs his backpack, he starts digging through his backpack, his trundle bag. We're like, this is where the hatchet comes out. And he pulls out a kerchief, which he wraps around his head, and then he gets back in and continues driving. And we realize at that point that we've been freezing the poor man to death.
Yes.
With the windows down.
Right.
We're like, cold, cold. He's like, yeah, cold.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's so funny.
But yeah, so language is interesting and trying to figure things out, and you know, this intercultural stuff that you try to figure out as you go along can be good. But then we all started laughing, and then I think he began to realize, you know, he was seeing his culture through our eyes. We were seeing our culture through his. And we spent 3 weeks together and just absolutely fell in love with him. You know?
Oh, so, nice. Yeah.
It was a great blessing. So yeah, it's a beautiful thing to get to know other people from other cultures, both for them and yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And to be able to be in a teaching situation is such a blessing.
It is. It is. Yeah, it's a great opportunity to learn a great deal. So I feel so blessed to be in this position.
Well, your article in Seminary Journal, it's spring 2023. Do you have a copy of it there? I usually hold it up and I realize I don't have it here.
Oh, yeah, I do.
Great. So it's Seminary Journal, spring 2023. All 10 articles are wonderful, and I just highly recommend them, both for seminarians, priests, but also for the laity. It's just full of so much information, and all of your articles really interconnected with one another, which was beautiful. So really, I thank you for being part of that project and for joining me today. This whole interdisciplinary set of articles is really, really important. Not just, like I said, not just for seminarians and priests, but for the laity. I really am, you know, I'm putting it out there on Facebook, encouraging people to get the journal and to listen to the interviews. They're important. This information is important for everybody. So thank you. All right. Why don't we end with a prayer?
Okay.
All right. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, we thank you, Lord, for our time together. We ask you to continue to bless our teaching efforts, both in the classroom and in our lives with family and friends in our communities, and obviously through the internet, through social media and these interviews. We ask that you touch the people that listen to these, and that the information through your grace gets where it's meant to be. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Thanks for having me. It was great to open up this dialogue, and so I learned a lot too. So thank you so much.
If you do you do any writing, if you've got any books down the line, get in touch with us. Yeah.
Okay, I will. Will do. All right. Yes. All right. All right. Thank you. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.